Welcome back to our deep dive into the darkest corners of the Invincible multiverse. In parts 1 and 2, we uncovered some of Mark Grayson's most twisted variants, but the rabbit hole goes even deeper. Today, we're cracking it wide open with 6 more horrifying versions that will shock even longtime fans. Angstrom Mark, what happens when the mind becomes a prison for hundreds of souls? Angstrom Mark represents one of the most psychologically horrifying variants in the entire multiverse, a being born not from heroism or villainy, but from a scientific experiment gone catastrophically wrong. In this twisted timeline, Angstrom Levy finally decides to follow through on his ultimate plan, fusing the consciousnesses of all his variants into one supreme being. But Levy, ever the coward, fears the process might destroy him in the merger. So he devises the perfect solution. Use a Mark Grayson corpse from another dimension as the host body. After all, Viltrumite physiology is far more durable than human biology, making it the ideal vessel for such a dangerous experiment. The procedure begins flawlessly. Levy's dimensional technology hums with power as it prepares to merge hundreds of Angstrom consciousnesses into the reanimated Mark's body. But then something goes wrong. Terribly, irreversibly wrong. The machine, designed to prioritize genetic signatures for the fusion process, detects Mark's Viltrumite DNA and makes a fatal error. Instead of connecting Angstrom variants, it begins linking every Mark Grayson that exists within each Angstrom's known universes. The result is an abomination beyond comprehension. Angstrom Mark awakens as a reanimated amalgamation of hundreds of different Mark Graysons from across the multiverse. But this isn't a simple resurrection. It's a permanent neural network connecting every variant's consciousness simultaneously. Every thought, every emotion, every memory, every moment of pain and joy experienced by hundreds of different Marks floods through this single body at once. Imagine experiencing your first kiss with Amber Bennett while simultaneously feeling the heartbreak of losing Eve Wilkins in another timeline. Picture the joy of saving your first life while also experiencing the trauma of accidentally killing innocent civilians in a dozen other realities. Angstrom Mark exists in a state of constant sensory and emotional overload, feeling every triumph and tragedy of hundreds of lives playing out in his mind like an endless, chaotic symphony. The psychological torture is unimaginable. Each connected Mark retains their individual consciousness while being forced to experience the collective pain of all the other. They feel each other's physical injuries, share each other's deepest fears, and are bombarded with memories that aren't their own. Some Marks remember being heroes who saved countless lives. Others recall being villains who destroyed entire civilizations. Some have loving families, while others watch their loved ones die by their own hands. The burden of this shared consciousness drives every connected Mark toward madness. Their individual lives crumble as they struggle to distinguish between their own experiences and those of their variants. A Mark who once had a healthy relationship with his father suddenly experiences the trauma of patricide from another timeline. A Mark who successfully saved his world is overwhelmed by the grief of failing in countless others, but the horror doesn't end there. The longer these minds remain connected, the stronger the bond becomes, spreading like a virus to other Mark Graysons across the multiverse. What started as an experiment involving hundreds of variants begins to encompass thousands, then tens of thousands. Each new connection adds another layer of consciousness to the collective, another voice screaming in the endless mental chaos. Angstrom Mark becomes a walking multiversal catastrophe. His physical body retains all of Mark Grayson's incredible strength and speed, but his pain tolerance is unlike anything seen before. When he's injured, the damage is distributed across the consciousness network, meaning hundreds of other Marks share the physical trauma. This makes him nearly impossible to incapacitate through traditional means. You're not just fighting one Mark, you're fighting the collective will of hundreds. The tragic irony is that somewhere within this madness, fragments of the original Mark's heroic nature still exist. Buried beneath layers of conflicting consciousness, parts of him desperately want to help people, to be the hero he once was. But every attempt at heroism is corrupted by the experiences of his darker variants. He might try to save someone only to be overwhelmed by memories of accidentally killing them in another timeline. Angstrom Mark's greatest fear isn't death, it's expansion. With each passing day, more Mark Graysons across the multiverse become connected to the network. He can feel them out there, Innocent variants living their lives, unaware that they're about to be dragged into this collective nightmare. He experiences their confusion as the connection forms, their terror as they realize what's happening, and their gradual descent into madness as they join the chorus of voices. The only hope, if it can be called that, lies in the possibility of connecting to a Mark variant powerful enough to sever the network. But this creates a horrifying paradox. The only Mark strong enough to stop the spread would likely be corrupted by joining it. Angstrom Mark exists in a state of desperate hope and crushing despair, simultaneously praying for salvation while knowing that any salvation might doom another innocent version of himself. What makes Angstrom Mark truly terrifying isn't his physical power, it's what he represents. He's the embodiment of identity loss, of consciousness without boundary, of the ultimate violation of individual existence. He shows us what happens when the barriers between self and other are completely destroyed, creating a being that is everyone and no one at the same time. Evan Grayson. Love can create miracles, but sometimes those miracles come at a price that's almost too terrible to comprehend. Evan Grayson represents one of the most heartbreaking variants in the multiverse, a being born from the ultimate sacrifice, living a lie that protects everyone except himself. This story begins, like so many others, with the brutal battle against Conquest. In this timeline, Mark fights with everything he has, pushing his powers to their absolute limit to protect the woman he loves, but victory comes at an unthinkable cost. Mark falls in battle, his body broken beyond even Viltrumite healing capabilities, while Eve clings to life with injuries that no medical technology can repair. As Eve's life force ebbs away, something unprecedented happens. The trauma of losing Mark, combined with her own approaching death, shatters the mental limiters that have always constrained her reality-altering abilities. These psychological barriers, installed to prevent her from accidentally rewriting existence itself, crumble under the weight of her grief and desperation. In her unconscious state, Eve's powers respond not to logic or training, but to pure emotional need. Her abilities reach out across dimensional barriers, breaking down the very fabric of reality in a desperate attempt to save the man she loves. But death isn't something that can be simply undone, even with reality warping powers. So her abilities find another solution, one that's both miraculous and tragic. Eve's powers disintegrate both their bodies at the atomic level, pulling apart every molecule, every strand of DNA, every trace of their existence. Then, guided by love and desperation rather than conscious thought, her abilities begin the most complex reconstruction in history. She attempts to fuse their genetic material into a single being, creating someone who can live even though they cannot. The process prioritizes Mark's genetic makeup. His Viltrumite heritage provides the durability and strength needed to house the merger. But Eve's DNA becomes intrinsically woven throughout, along with her incredible powers. What emerges isn't quite Mark and isn't quite Eve. It's someone entirely new, carrying traces of both but the complete memories of neither. When this new being awakens, he has no recollection of his previous lives. The trauma of death and resurrection has wiped clean the slate of memory, leaving behind someone who looks like Mark Grayson but has no idea who Mark Grayson was. He possesses incredible strength from his Viltrumite heritage and reality-manipulating abilities that rival Eve's at her peak, but he doesn't understand where these powers came from or why he has them. The surviving friends and allies, Cecil, the remaining guardians, William, and others, quickly piece together what happened. They realize that this new being is all that remains of both Mark and Eve, fused into a single existence by powers beyond comprehension. But they also understand the terrible implications. If this new person learns the truth about his creation, the emotional trauma could cause Eve's powers to spiral completely out of control. The decision they make is born from love but sustained by deception. They choose to create an entirely new identity for this being, telling him that his name is Evan Grayson. They craft a fictional backstory where he's Mark's previously unknown brother, someone who was raised away from Earth but has now returned to carry on the family legacy. They give him the hero name Adam Eve, claiming it's a tribute to his brother's fallen teammate. Evan accepts this fabricated history without question. Why wouldn't he? These people clearly care about him, and the story they tell makes sense of his abilities and his place in the world. He throws himself into heroism with the same dedication that both Mark and Eve once showed, becoming an extraordinary protector of Earth and beyond. But the lie creates its own tragedy. Evan lives every day surrounded by people who knew and loved the individuals he was created from. He sees the way Cecil sometimes stares at him with barely concealed grief. He notices how William occasionally slips and starts to say something, then catches himself. He feels the weight of expectations he doesn't understand, the burden of living up to legacies he never knew existed. What makes Evan's story particularly heartbreaking is that he's genuinely happy. He loves being a hero, loves protecting people, loves the sense of purpose his abilities give him. But his happiness is built on a foundation of collective trauma that everyone around him carries. His very existence is a daily reminder to his friends of what they lost, even as they're grateful for what they gained. The powers he inherited from Eve make him incredibly formidable, but they also make him incredibly dangerous. His reality-altering abilities respond to his subconscious desires and emotions, meaning that any significant psychological trauma could literally reshape existence around him. This is why the truth must remain hidden, not just to protect Evan's mental health, but to protect reality itself. Sometimes, late at night, Evan experiences dreams that feel more like memory. He sees flashes of flying with someone who looks just like him, of romantic moments with a pink-haired girl who feels familiar, of battles and friendships and losses that seem too real to be imagination. But when he wakes, he dismisses these as stress-induced fantasies, never realizing he's experiencing the bleeding through memories of his previous existence. The cruelest irony is that Evan occasionally feels lonely in ways he can't explain. He's surrounded by people who care about him, but sometimes he feels like he's missing something essential, a connection, a relationship, a part of himself that should be there but isn't. He doesn't realize he's feeling the absence of the love between Mark and Eve, a bond so powerful it transcended death itself to create him. Evan Grayson represents the ultimate question of identity and truth. Is it kinder to live a lie that brings happiness, or to know a truth that brings pain? His friends chose to protect him from knowledge that might destroy him, but in doing so, they've created a being who can never truly know himself. He's a living memorial to love's power, but also to love's limits, saved by the ultimate sacrifice, yet forever denied the knowledge of what was sacrificed for him. Psycho Slayer Mark. In the darkest corners of the multiverse, there exists a Mark Grayson who never learned the meaning of mercy, compassion, or restraint. This is Psycho Slayer Mark, a being who represents what happens when Viltrumite power is combined with unlimited bloodlust and an insatiable hunger for violence that transcends even the most brutal warrior cultures. This nightmare begins with Nolan's divergent path. In this timeline, Omni-Man never made it to Earth on his mission of conquest. Instead, something far worse happened. He defected from the Viltrumite Empire entirely, driven not by moral awakening or love for humanity, but by an insatiable thirst for combat that the Empire's methodical conquest couldn't satisfy. Nolan craved battle in its purest, most brutal form, and he found it in the galaxy's most notorious intergalactic fighting arena. This wasn't some civilized sporting competition. It was a blood-soaked gladiatorial nightmare where the galaxy's most violent beings came to prove their supremacy through death matches. Here, in arenas built from the bones of fallen civilizations, warriors from countless species fought not just for glory or freedom, but for the simple right to continue existing. The rules were simple: win or die, and preferably make it entertaining. Nolan didn't just participate, he dominated. His Viltrumite physiology made him nearly unstoppable, but it was his newfound sadism that made him legendary. He didn't just defeat opponents, he dismantled them with artistic brutality, turning each fight into a gruesome masterpiece of violence. For years, he reigned as the arena's undisputed champion, collecting wives from conquered worlds and building a reputation that made even hardened criminals whisper his name in fear. But the true horror began when one of his many wives gave birth to this universe's Mark. The birth itself was a portent of the monster to come. The infant didn't emerge naturally, but literally devoured his way out of his mother's womb, killing her in the process. Where most beings would be horrified by such an unnatural birth, Nolan was intrigued. This ravenous child represented something new, something that might finally match his own bloodthirst. Mark grew up in this environment of constant violence and death. His playground was the arena floor, his lullabies were the screams of the dying, his education consisted of learning increasingly creative ways to kill. But unlike his father, who had developed his sadistic tendencies over time, Mark was born with an appetite for violence that surpassed even Nolan's worst impulses. From his earliest years, Mark showed an unnatural fascination with not just defeating opponents, but consuming them. This wasn't symbolic dominance. He literally devoured the flesh of fallen enemies, gaining some sick satisfaction from this ultimate form of conquest. His fights became increasingly grotesque spectacles as audiences watched in horror and fascination while this child monster tore apart seasoned warriors and feasted upon their remains. As Mark matured, his reputation grew beyond even his father's. While Nolan was brutal, he was still recognizably a warrior following some twisted code of combat. Mark was something else entirely, a force of pure predatory instinct wrapped in Viltrumite power. He began to modify his fighting style, not for efficiency, but for maximum suffering. He would deliberately prolong battles, torturing opponents while the crowds roared, before finally ending their misery and beginning his gruesome feast. The arena planet's ecosystem actually began to change around Mark's presence. Other fighters became increasingly desperate, knowing that facing him meant not just death, but desecration. Some tried to poison themselves before matches, preferring to deny him the satisfaction of consumption. Others attempted elaborate suicide attacks, hoping to take him down with them. None succeeded. Mark's strength began to concern even Nolan. As his son grew more powerful, the older Viltrumite realized that he had created something beyond his ability to control. Mark's combat abilities were impressive, but it was his complete lack of restraint or fear that made him truly dangerous. Where Nolan still possessed some vestige of tactical thinking, Mark operated on pure instinct and hunger. The breaking point came when Nolan realized that Mark would eventually challenge him. It wasn't a question of if, but when. In this savage culture, it was only natural that the son would eventually attempt to overthrow the father. But Nolan hoped to face this challenge while he still had some advantage, before Mark's power and savagery surpassed his own completely. The father-son battle was the most watched event in the arena's history. 2 generations of Viltrumite power and sadism clashed in a fight that lasted for hours and left the arena floor literally soaked in blood. But while Nolan had experience and technique, Mark had something his father lacked. Absolute, unlimited hunger for victory at any cost. Mark didn't just defeat his father, he dismantled him systematically. Every technique Nolan had taught him, every strategy he had learned, Mark turned back against his creator with compound interest. And when the older Viltrumite finally fell, Mark performed his signature ritual, consuming his father's flesh while the crowd watched in stunned silence. With Nolan's death, Mark became not just the arena's champion, but its absolute ruler. He took the name Psycho Slayer, a title that struck fear into the hearts of beings across multiple star systems. Under his rule, the arena planet became a nexus of violence that attracted the galaxy's most bloodthirsty creatures, all hoping to prove themselves against the ultimate predator. But here's what makes Psycho Slayer Mark truly terrifying. He's not insane. He's completely rational within his own twisted worldview. He understands strategy, politics, and long-term planning. He's simply chosen to apply these skills toward the goal of causing maximum violence and suffering. He's not a mindless beast. He's an intelligent predator who has made violence into an art form. To this day, no being has managed to defeat the Psycho Slayer. He sits atop a throne literally built from the bones of his enemies, ruling over a planet where death is entertainment and survival is the only virtue. Those few who have escaped his arena carry tales of a Mark Grayson who represents the absolute worst possibilities of Viltrumite heritage, power without restraint, intelligence without compassion, and hunger without limit. Hellscape Mark. Sometimes the multiverse creates beings so broken, so thoroughly stripped of everything that makes us human, that they become less than monsters. They become forces of nature. Hellscape Mark represents the absolute nadir of existence, a version of Mark Grayson forged in literal hell and shaped by endless suffering into something that barely remembers it was once human. This horror story begins with Nolan's capture by a fanatical group of space mercenaries, beings driven by hatred for the Viltrumite Empire so pure that it corrupted them beyond redemption. These weren't ordinary soldiers or freedom fighters, they were war criminals so brutal that even the coalition of planets, desperate for allies against the Viltrumites, had exiled them for their unspeakable methods. Led by a former coalition member whose hatred for Viltrumites had consumed his sanity, these mercenaries had spent decades developing the perfect torture for their enemies. They had discovered a foreign toxin that could cripple a Viltrumite's nervous system without killing them, leaving them paralyzed but conscious, helpless but aware. When they captured Nolan, they saw an opportunity to test their most ambitious project yet. They brought him to a planet known only as Hellscape, a world that existed as a monument to cruelty. The planet's surface was a wasteland of toxic storms and acid rain, but the real horror lay underground, in massive prison complexes carved from living rock. Here, the mercenaries conducted their ultimate experiment, forcing captured beings to breed armies of slaves while experiencing constant torture. The conditions were designed to break every aspect of civilized existence. Prisoners were given barely enough food to survive, often forced to compete violently for scraps. They were tortured daily, not for information or compliance, but simply to maintain their desperation and savagery. Many inhabitants lost their humanity entirely, becoming cannibalistic animals who would devour their own kind without hesitation. When Nolan was introduced to this nightmare, he was already weakened by the toxin. The mercenaries forced him to breed with other prisoners, creating a generation of hybrid offspring who inherited not just his genetic material, but the neurological damage caused by his chemical torture. The toxin had altered his DNA at a fundamental level, ensuring that every child born from him would carry a legacy of brain damage and psychological trauma. Most of these children died in infancy, unable to survive the harsh conditions of Hellscape. Others lived but were so damaged that they became mindless creatures, operating on pure instinct. But one child, Mark, proved to be different. He not only survived, but grew stronger and more ruthless than all the others, as if the suffering that destroyed his siblings somehow fed his development. From his earliest moments, Mark experienced nothing but violence and deprivation. He was constantly tested on, mutilated, and experimented upon by both the mercenaries and the other prisoners. The other inmates saw him as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be consumed. The guards viewed him as the perfect subject for their most sadistic experiments. He learned to speak not through education, but by screaming. He learned to move not through play, but by fighting for survival. The neurological damage inherited from his father affected Mark in unique ways. While other victims of the toxin became paralyzed or catatonic, Mark's brain adapted by shutting down higher functions like speech, reasoning, and emotional processing. What remained was pure survival instinct enhanced by Viltrumite physiology. He became something that was technically alive but functionally animalistic, a creature of pure reaction and instinct. Because Nolan was imprisoned and unable to teach him, Mark never learned to fly. Instead, he developed exceptional ground-based abilities, incredible running speed, the ability to leap vast distances, and most importantly, the capacity to move through underground tunnels and confined spaces with inhuman agility. His body adapted to the subterranean environment, becoming a perfect predator for Hellscape's twisted ecosystem. Without language or rational thought, Mark communicated through violence. He learned to read threats and opportunities through body language, scent, and sound. He developed an intuitive understanding of weak points and vulnerabilities that surpassed anything formal training could provide. He became, quite literally, a human weapon shaped by endless trauma. What makes Hellscape Mark particularly terrifying is his complete absence of recognizable humanity. He doesn't hate his enemies, doesn't enjoy violence, doesn't even understand concepts like revenge or justice. He simply exists in a state of permanent survival mode, reacting to threats with immediate, overwhelming violence. He's not evil in any conventional sense. Evil requires choice, and Mark has been stripped of the capacity for choice. His fighting style reflects his upbringing. He doesn't use techniques or strategies. He uses pure, instinctual brutality enhanced by superhuman strength and speed. He fights like a cornered animal, but an animal with the power to shatter mountains. Every movement is economical, focused entirely on causing maximum damage as quickly as possible. He doesn't waste energy on intimidation or showmanship because he doesn't understand these concepts. The neurological damage has created a being who exists in permanent fight-or-flight mode. His brain can't process complex thoughts or emotions, but it's incredibly efficient at identifying threats and responding with violence. He can detect danger through senses that normal beings don't even recognize, and his responses are instantaneous and disproportionate. Perhaps most tragic of all, somewhere deep within this broken creature, Fragments of what might have been Mark Grayson still exist. Occasionally, when he's not under immediate threat, observers have noted moments where he seems almost confused, as if he's trying to remember something important but can't quite grasp what it is. These moments never last long. The slightest provocation sends him back into survival mode. Hellscape Mark represents the ultimate question of nature versus nurture. This is what happens when someone with the genetic potential to be humanity's greatest hero is instead shaped entirely by humanity's greatest cruelties. He shows us that heroism isn't inevitable, that even the strongest foundations can be corrupted if subjected to enough trauma. He's not just a villain or a monster, he's a tragedy in the shape of a weapon. A reminder that the environments we create shape the beings we become. Hellscape Mark is what we get when we abandon compassion and embrace cruelty as a way of life. He's the child we all could have been if we had been born into hell. Viltrumite Defector Mark. Power corrupts, but sometimes corruption can be redeemed, though the price of redemption might be higher than anyone is willing to pay. Viltrumite Defector Mark represents one of the most complex and morally ambiguous variants in the multiverse, a being who achieved ultimate power only to sacrifice everything in the name of peace. This Mark's story begins not with Nolan as his father, but with Thrag, the most brutal and uncompromising leader in Viltrumite history. In this timeline, Mark is born as the heir to the Viltrumite Empire's most feared ruler, destined from birth to become an instrument of conquest and oppression. But sometimes the greatest heroes emerge from the darkest origins. Growing up as Thrag's son meant experiencing childhood as a military campaign, Mark's youth and early adulthood consisted almost entirely of relentless training designed to forge him into the perfect Viltrumite weapon. Every day brought new lessons in combat, strategy, and the ruthless philosophy that justified Viltrumite supremacy. Thrag didn't raise a son, he created a general. The training was brutal beyond imagination. Thrag believed that suffering created strength. So Mark's education included beatings that would have killed normal beings, psychological torture designed to eliminate weakness, and combat scenarios where failure meant genuine death. By the time Mark reached adulthood, he had become physically one of the most formidable Viltrumites in history. His body and mind honed to lethal perfection. Despite his inner distaste for the Empire's methods, feelings he carefully hid from his father, Mark rose through the ranks to become one of its most imposing generals. He led the conquest of countless worlds, watching civilizations crumble before Viltrumite might, seeing entire species reduced to slavery or extinction. With each victory, he grew stronger and more skilled, but also more hollow inside. The contradiction at the heart of Mark's existence was profound. He possessed incredible tactical genius and fighting ability, making him indispensable to the Empire. But every successful mission filled him with self-loathing as he witnessed the suffering caused by his actions. He became expert at compartmentalizing his emotions, performing his duties with ruthless efficiency, while secretly questioning everything he had been taught. The turning point came when Thrag assigned Mark a mission that seemed routine. Eliminate Nolan, a Viltrumite defector who had abandoned his post and was reportedly living among primitive beings on a backwater planet called Earth. For most Viltrumites, this would have been a simple execution. But when Mark confronted Nolan, something unexpected happened. As Nolan faced death, he didn't beg for mercy or try to fight his way out. Instead, he spoke about the life he had found beyond the Empire, the love, the family, the sense of purpose that came from protecting rather than conquering. He described a world where strength was used to help the weak rather than dominate them, where diversity was celebrated rather than eliminated, where individuals had value beyond their usefulness to the state. Mark had been conditioned to dismiss such words as weakness, but something about Nolan's calm acceptance of death gave them weight. This wasn't the desperate pleading of a coward. It was the testimony of someone who had found something worth dying for. As Mark listened, he began to understand that there might be alternatives to the only life he had ever known. But Mark's moment of doubt didn't go unnoticed. Thrag had been watching his son carefully, looking for signs of the weakness that had claimed other Viltrumite leaders. When he detected Mark's inner conflict, he made a characteristically brutal decision. Mark had become too compassionate and therefore too dangerous to the Empire's stability. Thrag's solution was elegant in its cruelty. He ordered 30 of his most loyal Viltrumite soldiers to ambush Mark during what was supposed to be a routine mission. The attack was designed to look like enemy action, giving Thrag plausible deniability while eliminating a son who had become a liability. The battle was fierce and prolonged. 30-to-1 odds would normally be overwhelming even for a Viltrumite, but Mark had been trained by the best and forged in the crucible of Thrag's brutal methodology. More importantly, he was fighting not just for survival, but for the right to choose his own path. When the dust settled, Mark was the only Viltrumite left alive, surrounded by the corpses of soldiers he had once called comrade. The betrayal completed Mark's transformation. His father hadn't just tried to kill him, he had proven that the Empire valued loyalty over family, obedience over love, conformity over individual worth. Everything Nolan had said about life beyond the Empire suddenly made perfect sense. Mark fled, seeking out the coalition of planets and offering them something unprecedented, the tactical knowledge and scientific expertise of a high-ranking Viltrumite general. But his most valuable contribution was a proposal that seemed impossible. What if they could neutralize the Viltrumite Empire without genocide? Working with the coalition's greatest scientists, Mark helped develop a specialized strain of the Scourge virus that wouldn't kill Viltrumites but would remove their superhuman healing abilities and make them nearly mortal. It was a weapon that could level the playing field without requiring mass extinction. When the final siege against the Viltrumite Empire began, Mark led the attack personally. But his greatest act of courage wasn't military, it was moral. As the virus was deployed, Mark exposed himself to it as well, demonstrating to his people that he wasn't seeking to rule them, but to free them. He showed them that their new existence wouldn't be about Viltrumite superiority, but about equality and peace. The sight of Thrag and his most loyal followers succumbing to the virus they had never imagined could affect them was both terrible and liberating. For the first time in their history, Viltrumites faced the prospect of mortality, of having to earn their place in the universe rather than simply taking it by force. Mark's leadership of the surviving Viltrumites marked the beginning of a new chapter for his people. No longer conquerors, but not yet fully trusted as allies, they had to learn entirely new ways of existing. Mark himself became their guide through this transformation, helping them discover that strength could be used for protection rather than domination. But redemption came at a cost. Mark aged more rapidly due to the virus, his once immortal lifespan now measured in decades rather than millennia. His body, no longer capable of its previous healing, bore the scars of countless battles. Most painfully, he lived with the knowledge of every atrocity he had committed in service to the Empire, every world he had helped destroy, every life he had ended in the name of Viltrumite supremacy. Viltrumite Defector Mark represents the possibility of redemption, even for those who seem beyond saving. He shows us that it's possible to break free from even the most oppressive systems, but that freedom requires sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to accept responsibility for past actions. He proves that the greatest victory isn't conquest, but the choice to be better than what you were made to be. Symbiote Mark. What happens when two of the most powerful beings in their respective universes merge into something greater than the sum of their parts? Symbiote Mark represents the ultimate fusion of Viltrumite power and alien enhancement, but this partnership comes with psychological and physical costs that push the boundaries of what it means to be human. The story begins with an interdimensional accident that brings the Venom symbiote into the Invincible universe. Unlike its usual journey to Earth through space travel, this symbiote arrives through a tear in reality itself, damaged and desperate after being separated from its previous host during a cosmic catastrophe. The creature is dying, its alien physiology breaking down without a compatible partner to sustain it. When the symbiote encounters Mark Grayson, it doesn't sense just another potential host. It discovers something unprecedented. Mark's Viltrumite DNA represents the perfect symbiotic partner. Incredibly durable, naturally adaptive, and possessing a healing factor that could repair the damage the symbiote has sustained. But more than that, Mark's emotional complexity and strong moral foundation offer the symbiote something it has never experienced before: genuine partnership rather than parasitic dominance. The initial bonding process is unlike anything either being has experienced. The symbiote, used to forcing itself onto unwilling hosts, finds Mark's natural resilience creates a unique dynamic. Instead of completely overwhelming Mark's personality, the symbiote discovers it must negotiate, compromise, and actually communicate with its host. Mark, meanwhile, experiences an immediate increase in his already formidable abilities, but also becomes aware of an alien consciousness sharing his thoughts and emotions. The enhancement effects are dramatic and multifaceted. Mark's baseline Viltrumite strength, already capable of moving mountains, increases exponentially. The symbiote's adaptive properties allow him to survive in environments that would challenge even Viltrumite physiology, the vacuum of space, the crushing depths of ocean trenches, the radioactive cores of dying stars. His healing factor becomes so advanced that he can regenerate from injuries that would normally require weeks of recovery in mere minutes. But the most significant changes are psychological. The symbiote brings with it memories of countless hosts across the universe, giving Mark access to combat techniques, languages, and cultural knowledge from dozens of different species. He develops an intuitive understanding of alien technology and biology that makes him uniquely qualified to deal with extraterrestrial threats. However, this partnership also amplifies Mark's existing weaknesses while creating new ones. Viltrumites are vulnerable to specific sonic frequencies, and the symbiote shares this weakness while adding its own sensitivity to intense heat. More troubling, the symbiote's predatory instincts occasionally clash with Mark's heroic nature, creating internal conflicts that can be exploited by enemies who understand the dynamic. The relationship between Mark and the symbiote evolves into something unprecedented in the creature's long history. Instead of the typical host-parasite relationship, they develop a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. The symbiote, influenced by Mark's moral compass, begins to understand concepts like heroism and self-sacrifice. Mark, in turn, learns to appreciate the symbiote's perspective on survival and adaptation. This partnership proves especially valuable during Mark's confrontation with his father. When Omni-Man reveals his true purpose on Earth, the symbiote's presence provides Mark with both the physical enhancement needed to match his father's power and the emotional support to resist Nolan's psychological manipulation. The alien's complete lack of familial attachment helps Mark maintain his resolve when family loyalty might have weakened his determination. The symbiote's adaptive abilities also allow Mark to develop new combat techniques that blend Viltrumite brutality with alien versatility. He can shapeshift his body into weapons, create protective armor that's stronger than any human technology, and even separate parts of the symbiote to create temporary constructs while maintaining the bulk of their partnership. During the Angstrom Levy crisis, symbiote Mark's enhanced abilities prove crucial. The symbiote's multiversal nature, MISPI, having existed across multiple realities before arriving in Mark's universe, provides insights into dimensional travel that help counter Levy's attacks. The creature's memories include encounters with similar reality-manipulating beings, giving Mark tactical advantages that his canon counterpart lacks. The Viltrumite War presents unique challenges for this partnership. When confronting other Viltrumites, the symbiote's presence must be carefully managed. Some Viltrumites view the partnership as weakness or contamination, while others recognize it as a tactical advantage. The symbiote's ability to interface with Viltrumite technology provides Mark with enhanced understanding of his heritage, but it also makes him a target for those who see any deviation from pure Viltrumite genetics as heresy. Perhaps most significantly, the symbiote's influence affects Mark's approach to leadership and responsibility. The alien's long-term perspective, having survived for millennia across multiple hosts and realities, helps Mark understand that some problems require patience and gradual change rather than immediate heroic intervention. This wisdom proves invaluable when Mark eventually takes on greater responsibilities within the Viltrumite Empire. The partnership also creates unique reproductive and genetic questions. The symbiote's presence affects Mark's DNA in subtle ways, potentially influencing any offspring he might have. This becomes a source of both concern and curiosity as Mark considers starting a family with Eve. The symbiote's protective instincts extend to Mark's loved ones, creating a secondary layer of defense for those he cares about. One of the most interesting aspects of this variant is how the symbiote's moral evolution mirrors Mark's own growth. As Mark becomes more experienced and confident as a hero, the symbiote learns to channel its predatory instincts into protective ones. They develop a shared identity that's neither fully human nor fully alien, but something entirely new. The long-term implications of this partnership extend beyond individual enhancement. Symbiote Mark represents a new form of evolution. The voluntary merging of different species to create something greater than either could achieve alone. He demonstrates that true strength comes not from dominance or purity, but from adaptation, cooperation, and the willingness to embrace change. In battle, Symbiote Mark is a sight to behold. The visual of a Viltrumite enhanced by alien biotechnology creates a being that's both beautiful and terrifying. His appearance shifts constantly as the symbiote responds to threats and opportunities, creating a warrior who's never quite the same twice, but always perfectly adapted to the situation at hand. Symbiote Mark proves that evolution doesn't have to be a slow, natural process. Sometimes it can be a conscious choice to become something better than what you were born to be. Which variant disturbed you the most? Let us know in the comments. And that concludes part 3 of our Darkest Variants series. If you missed the first 2 chapters, be sure to check them out. The multiverse is infinite, so let me know in the comments who you want to see next. Subscribe so you don't miss part 4. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the infinite possibilities of Mark Grayson's story.